A horse with no rider walked into town at first light, blood on the saddle, a dead man's secrets in the satchel, and it stopped. Right in front of a seamstress shop where a woman had been sewing shirts alone for 2 years, ever since her father died, in an accident that wasn't an accident at all. Hannah Halstead had no idea that the man who brought her wildflowers every Sunday was the same man who murdered her father. She had no idea that the fiancé who abandoned her 3 years ago didn't leave by choice. He was threatened into silence. And she had no idea that the bleeding stranger who collapsed on her doorstep was carrying proof of everything. But here's the detail that will haunt you long after this story ends. 3 months before that stranger ever arrived, Hannah woke up one morning and sewed a shirt for no one. No customer, no order, no reason. She just knew. Someone was coming. Someone who would need it. And she added 8 buttons instead of 7. Because the 8th button was never about clothing. It was about hope. Why 8 buttons? Stay until the end. That answer will break your heart and put it back together. Welcome to Cowboy Dusk channel, where the wind of the Old West carries stories of love that outlasts betrayal, courage that outlasts fear, and the quiet, stubborn hope that outlasts everything. This story will remind you that sometimes the people meant for us are already on their way. We just have to keep believing long enough for them to arrive, and that the smallest act of hope, even a single extra button sewn in silence, can become the thing that saves everything.
A horse with no rider walked into Taylor, Texas at first light. Blood on the saddle, a leather satchel strapped tight to the horn. The animal moved slow and deliberate down the center of Main Street, hooves raising small clouds of limestone dust that caught the early sun and turned to gold before settling back to nothing. The horse stopped in front of a small seamstress shop with a hand-painted sign that read, "Halstead Seamstress and Alterations," and it stood there like it knew exactly where it was going and had no intention of going anywhere else. Hannah Halstead saw it through the window. She had been up since before dawn, the way she always was, because sleep had become something that visited her less and less in the 2 years since her father died. She was 25 years old, and she ran the shop alone, and she filled the empty hours with work, because work was the one thing that never left her. Her needle moved through blue cotton with the steady rhythm of a woman who had sewn 10,000 stitches before breakfast and would sew 10,000 more before supper. The shirt she was finishing was for Mr. Hargrove at the bank, who liked his collars stiff and his seams straight, and who always paid on time, which in Taylor was worth more than compliments. The sound of the horse stopping made her look up. Through the slat shutters she could see the animal standing at the hitching post, sides heaving, head low. It was a good horse, a working horse with strong lines and a deep chest built for distance. The kind of horse a man depended on with his life. And there was blood on the saddle, dark and dried in the shape of a handprint, where someone had gripped the horn and then let go. Hannah set down her work. She did not panic. Panic was a luxury for women who had someone else to handle their problems, and Hannah had not had that luxury in a very long time. She stepped outside into the morning heat, already thick at this hour, carrying with it the smell of creosote from the new railroad ties stacked at the construction site 3 blocks east. The rhythmic clang of hammers rang from the rail yard like a second heartbeat for the town, steady and relentless, the sound of progress that never asked permission. She went to the horse first, gave it water from the trough, spoke to it low and calm the way her father had taught her, rubbing the flat of her hand along its neck where the muscles trembled with exhaustion. The horse had run hard and run far, and it had come here on purpose. Horses did not wander into towns and stop at specific doors by accident. Someone had pointed this animal toward Taylor, and the animal had done what it was told. Then she opened the satchel. Inside she found 2 things. The first was a small leather-bound ledger, no bigger than her hand, filled with cramped handwriting that she did not recognize. Columns of names and numbers and dates, the kind of careful record-keeping that spoke of transactions. She did not read it. It was not hers, and Hannah Halstead believed in minding what belonged to her and leaving alone what did not. The second thing was a photograph. It was small and slightly bent at one corner, The kind of photograph taken at a studio, or perhaps out in the field by one of those traveling cameramen who set up in mining camps and cattle towns. Two men stood in front of what looked like a silver mine, timber framing behind them, a hillside of loose rock and scrub brush. One of the men was young, maybe 20, with dark hair and a lean face that Hannah did not recognize. The other man was older. Hannah stopped breathing. The older man had his hand resting on the timber frame, his posture easy and confident, a slight smile on his face. He was younger in the photograph than she had ever known him, maybe 10 years before she was born. But she would know that face anywhere, the set of the jaw, the way he stood with his weight on his left foot, the hands that had taught her to thread a needle when she was 4 years old. It was her father, Frederick Halstead, standing in front of a silver mine he had never once mentioned in all the years she knew him. Her father, who was a tailor from Pennsylvania. Her father, who came to Texas looking for opportunity and found it behind a sewing machine. Her father, who died 2 years ago when his horse supposedly threw him on the road outside town. She could hear Mrs. Cooper's voice in her head, the words the old woman had whispered at the funeral when she thought nobody could hear. I never once saw Frederick Halstead fall off a horse in 30 years. Hannah put the photograph in her apron pocket and the ledger back in the satchel and buckled it shut. Her hands were steady. Her mind was not. The sound of boots on the boardwalk made her turn. Mrs. Cooper herself was hurrying across the street from the boarding house, her face flushed with the kind of excitement that always meant news. And news in Taylor usually meant trouble. Martha Cooper was 62 years old with a spine like a fence post, and opinions she distributed as freely as her biscuits. She was the closest thing Hannah had to family, which said something about the state of Hannah's family, and something else about the size of Mrs. Cooper's heart. The old woman reached Hannah and grabbed her arm. You need to hear this before you hear it from anyone else. What happened? Town council met last night behind closed doors. The railroad expansion plan went through. They're widening the line and building a new depot, and the whole south side of Main Street is in the path. Hannah felt the ground shift under her feet. Her shop was on the south side of Main Street. My shop, your shop, the Henderson's feed store, Doc Rollins' office, the whole block. You have 60 days to vacate or file an appeal, but Hannah, the man behind the project, is Judge Whitfield, and nobody in this town has ever won an appeal against Vernon Whitfield. Judge Vernon Whitfield. The name sat in Hannah's chest like a stone. He was the most powerful man in Taylor. He had built the church. He had funded the school. He had brought the railroad to town in the first place, and now he was using it to swallow everything in its path. He was also the man who had been bringing Hannah wildflowers every Sunday for the past year, who spoke to her with a gentleness that never quite reached his eyes, who had a way of standing too close and staying too long that made her skin crawl, even as she smiled and said, "Thank you, because you did not offend Judge Vernon Whitfield, not if you wanted to keep living in his town." 60 days, Hannah said. 60 days. Mrs. Cooper squeezed her arm. We will figure something out. We always do. But the old woman's voice carried a doubt that neither of them acknowledged. And when she went back to the boarding house, Hannah stood alone on the porch of her shop with her father's photograph in her pocket, and a horse she did not own, and a world that felt like it was closing in from all sides. She looked at the photograph one more time. Her father. A silver mine. A stranger. And a ledger full of secrets in a dead man's satchel. "What were you mixed up in, Papa?" she whispered. The horse stamped and blew and did not answer. Hannah went back inside and picked up her needle and tried to finish Mr. Hargrove's shirt. But her hands kept returning to the photograph, and her eyes kept drifting to the window, and somewhere deep in her chest a feeling was building that she could not name, not fear exactly. Something closer to the feeling you get before a thunderstorm, when the air goes heavy and still and you know that something is coming, but you do not know yet whether it will water the crops or flatten the barn. She was still sitting there, needle in hand, when the afternoon light shifted and a shadow fell across the doorway. A man walked into Taylor on foot. His clothes were torn. His left shoulder was wrapped in a makeshift bandage. a strip of fabric dark with dried blood that had gone stiff in the heat. He was tall and lean, and moved like a man who was used to covering ground but had covered too much of it in too short a time. He went straight to the horse tied in front of her shop, pressed his forehead against the animal's neck, and said in a voice rough with exhaustion and something that sounded very much like grief, "I knew you would find the way." Then his legs gave out and he collapsed on her doorstep. Hannah was on her feet before he hit the ground. Jackson Foster woke to the sound of a needle piercing fabric, steady and even as a heartbeat, a small, precise sound that repeated itself again and again in the darkness behind his closed eyes. And for a moment he was confused because the last thing he remembered was desert and dust, and the smell of his own blood and Eli Morgan's voice saying, "Take the ledger to Taylor, find the seamstress on Main Street. She will know what to do." Then the pain in his shoulder announced itself like a hot iron pressed to skin, and he remembered everything. He opened his eyes. He was lying on a narrow cot in a small room behind what appeared to be a shop. Bolts of fabric were stacked on shelves along one wall. A dress form stood in the corner wearing the skeleton of an unfinished garment. The light was soft and warm, filtered through a curtain that separated this back room from whatever lay beyond it. And on the other side of that curtain he could hear the needle still moving. The first thing he smelled was not blood. It was clean linen and lavender. 48 hours. That was all it had been since the world ended. 2 days ago, Jackson Foster and Eli Morgan had been camped outside El Paso, running on bad coffee and worse luck, planning how to get a leather-bound ledger from the Dalton gang's camp to someone who could use it. The ledger proved what Eli had spent 3 years trying to prove. That Judge Vernon Whitfield in Taylor, Texas, the most upstanding citizen in 4 counties, had been secretly financing the Dalton gang's gun-running operation. Rifles sold to hostile territories in exchange for gold that flowed through a dozen false accounts and came out clean on the other side, funding Whitfield's railroad investments and land acquisitions and political ambitions. Hundreds of rifles, thousands of dollars. And anyone who got close to the truth had a way of dying in accidents that were never quite investigated. Eli had been the one to find the ledger. Eli Morgan, former Confederate cavalry, gray-bearded and limping from a war wound that never healed right, the closest thing Jackson had to family, since his own family was nothing but grave markers and bad memories. Eli had infiltrated the Dalton camp by pretending to be a down-on-his-luck prospector looking for work. It took him 4 months. When he finally got his hands on the ledger, he and Jackson rode out at midnight and the Daltons were on their trail before dawn. They almost made it. The bullet caught Eli in the back as they crested a ridge 12 miles from the nearest town. Jackson heard it hit and turned in time to see his friend slump forward in the saddle, one hand gripping the horn, the other pressed against his chest where the blood was already spreading. Eli stayed mounted for another 100 yards by sheer stubbornness, then slid off his horse and landed in the sand, and did not get up. Jackson knelt beside him. The stars were so bright they seemed angry about something. Eli's breath came in short, shallow gasps, and his eyes were clear in the way that dying men's eyes sometimes are, as if they could see past the edges of the world to whatever lay beyond. "Take the ledger to Taylor," Eli said. His voice was barely there. "Find the seamstress on Main Street. She will know what to do. Eli, hold on. Let me stop the bleeding." "You cannot stop this kind of bleeding, son. You know that." Eli grabbed Jackson's wrist with surprising strength. "The seamstress. Her name is Halstead. She is Frederick's daughter. She is the only one you can trust. You hear me? The only one. I hear you. Do not let them win. Do not let Whitfield win. Frederick died for this. I am dying for this. You make it count. I will." Eli Morgan closed his eyes and did not open them again. Jackson buried him where he fell because there was no time to do more, and he marked the spot with stones, and rode through the rest of the night with the ledger in his satchel, and a bullet graze on his own shoulder that bled more than it should have, and a hole in his chest where his best friend used to be. He sent the horse ahead when his own strength started to fail, tied the satchel to the horn, pointed the animal toward Taylor, and trusted it to find the way. Eli had trained that horse himself. It was smart and stubborn and loyal, and it had never let either of them down. Jackson walked the last 10 miles on foot, and when he saw the horse standing outside a small seamstress shop on Main Street, he knew Eli had been right about one more thing. Now he was lying in that seamstress's back room with his shoulder on fire and the sound of her needle in his ears. He pushed himself up on his good arm, and the curtain moved, and she was there. She was not what he expected. He had expected someone older, someone who looked like she might have answers. Instead, she was young, maybe 25, with brown hair pinned up in a practical way that left the back of her neck exposed, and eyes that were the green of new grass after rain. She was not beautiful in the way that stopped men on the street, but she was striking in the way that a well-made blade is striking. All clean lines and purpose. She looked at him the way a person looks at a problem they have already begun solving. "You lost a fair amount of blood," she said. Her voice was calm and even, the voice of someone who did not waste words. "The wound is not deep, but it was dirty. I cleaned it and stitched it. You should not move that arm for at least a week." Jackson looked down at his shoulder. His shirt was gone, cut away, and in its place was a bandage wrapped with the precision of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. The stitches beneath it, he could tell from the way they pulled, were small and even and professional. "You stitched me up with a sewing needle," he said. "I use what I have," she said. "I am a seamstress, not a doctor. But needle and thread is needle and thread, and I have a steadier hand than Doc Rawlins after his second whiskey, which is usually by 10 in the morning." Jackson almost smiled. It surprised him. He had not come close to smiling since Eli died. She brought him water, and he drank it, and then she stood there with her arms crossed and looked at him with an expression that he recognized. It was the expression of a woman who was about to ask questions and expected answers. "Your horse came to my shop with a satchel full of someone else's secrets," she said. "Then you came to my shop full of someone else's blood. I did not read the ledger because it is not mine. But if you are bringing trouble to my town, I have a right to know what kind." No fear in her voice. No fluttering curiosity. Just the flat, practical demand of a woman who had been taking care of herself long enough to know that information was worth more than politeness. Jackson respected it. He also was not ready to give her everything. Not yet. "My name is Jackson Foster," he said. "I was sent here by a man named Eli Morgan. He told me to find you. He said you would know what to do." The name did not register. Hannah frowned and shook her head. "I do not know anyone by that name." Jackson studied her. She was not lying. He could see that. "Tall man," he said. "Gray beard. Walks with a limp. Old war wound in his right leg. Played chess like he had a personal grudge against every piece on the board." Hannah went still. The color drained from her face and came back different, not pale with shock, but flushed with something deeper. Recognition. Memory. Pain. "That is Mr. Brennan," she said slowly. "Eli Brennan. He was a friend of my father. He came to our house every Thursday evening for tea and chess for as long as I can remember. He disappeared 2 years ago, right after my father died. No one knew where he went or why. Eli Brennan, not Eli Morgan. The man had been living in Taylor under a false name, hiding in Whitfield's own town, right under the judge's nose. The courage of it, or maybe the recklessness, made Jackson's chest tighten. "He was using a false name," Jackson said carefully. "His real name was Eli Morgan. And I am sorry to tell you this, Miss Halstead, but he is dead. He died 2 days ago helping me get that ledger out of a very bad place. He died telling me to find you." Hannah said nothing for a long time. She stood very still with her hands at her sides and her jaw set, and her green eyes bright with something that was not tears, not quite, but was close enough. Then she turned and walked into the back room and came back carrying a blue cotton shirt. "A customer ordered this and never came back to claim it," she said. "It should fit you. You cannot walk around Taylor with no shirt and blood on your skin. People will talk, and in this town, talk gets back to the wrong ears faster than a telegraph." Jackson took the shirt. It was well made, the stitching tight and even, the fabric soft but sturdy. He pulled it on carefully, favoring his wounded shoulder, and it fit him better than any shirt he had owned in years. a little loose at the waist but right across the shoulders and chest, like it had been made for someone built exactly like him. He buttoned it up and stopped. He counted the buttons again to be sure. 8. 8 buttons instead of the usual 7. He looked up to ask about it, but Hannah had already turned away and disappeared through the curtain, and the sound of her needles started again on the other side, steady and sure as a heartbeat. Jackson stood there in the clean blue shirt with the extra button pressing against his sternum, and had the strange and certain feeling that this shirt had not been waiting for a customer who never came back. It had been waiting for him. Judge Vernon Whitfield arrived at Hannah's shop at 9 o'clock the next morning, wearing a white felt hat, polished boots that had never seen a stirrup, and the smile of a man accustomed to being obeyed. He carried a bouquet of wildflowers in one hand and a property seizure notice in the other. Hannah saw him coming through the window and felt the familiar tightening in her chest that his visits always produced. Not fear, exactly, something more complicated. The feeling of being watched by a predator that had not yet decided whether to pounce. She had hidden Jackson in the back room. He was not happy about it, but she had explained the situation in terms he could not argue with. If Whitfield sees a strange man in my shop, he will ask questions. And Judge Whitfield's questions have teeth. Jackson had gone behind the curtain without another word, which told Hannah that he understood power even if he did not like bending to it. The bell above the door chimed, and Whitfield walked in, filling the small shop with his presence the way a large piece of furniture fills a small room. He was 55 years old, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, and handsome in the way that aging men of wealth and authority sometimes manage. All polished surfaces and careful grooming that disguised the rust underneath. He had been widowed for 8 years. His wife, by all accounts, had been a quiet woman who smiled a great deal, and never contradicted her husband, and died of pneumonia that some people whispered might have been something else entirely. "Good morning, Hannah." He set the wildflowers on her cutting table with the proprietary ease of a man placing his hat on his own shelf. "I brought you something to brighten the shop." "That is kind of you, Judge. Thank you. Vernon, please. I have asked you to call me Vernon." He had asked her every week for a year, and every week she found a way to use his title instead, because the title kept a wall between them that his first name would not. Judge Whitfield was a civic figure she was required to respect. Vernon was a man who wanted something from her that she had no intention of giving. He looked around the shop with an appraiser's eye, cataloging the bolts of fabric, the dress form, the neat rows of thread and buttons, the small life she had built from nothing after her father died. "I imagine you have heard about the railroad expansion," he said. "Mrs. Cooper told me." "It is progress, Hannah. The town needs room to grow. The railroad is the future, and those of us who stand in the path of the future must be willing to step aside for the greater good." He produced the seizure notice from his coat pocket and laid it on the table beside the flowers. "This is the formal notice, 60 days. But I want you to know that I'm prepared to offer you a very generous settlement, far above the market value of this property. Enough for you to open a new shop on the north side of town, perhaps something larger, more suitable to your talents." His voice was warm and reasonable, and that was the most dangerous thing about Vernon Whitfield. He never raised his voice. He never threatened directly. He simply made it clear through the weight of his words and the reach of his influence that cooperation was the only sensible choice. Men who defied him lost their businesses. Women who refused him found their reputations quietly shredded. And at least one man, Hannah's father, had died under circumstances that nobody looked at too closely because nobody wanted to be the next person Judge Whitfield noticed. Hannah picked up the seizure notice and read it carefully. She had learned long ago that reading things carefully was the only defense a woman without power had against men who had too much of it. "I will consider your offer," she said, which meant she would not consider it at all, but needed time to figure out what else to do. Whitfield smiled. It was a good smile, practiced and warm and utterly empty of anything real. "I hope you will. I would hate to see you struggle unnecessarily. A woman of your gifts deserves better than a fight she cannot win." He let the word cannot sit in the air between them for a moment, then picked up his hat from where he had placed it on the counter. That was when he saw Jackson. Not in the back room. Jackson had evidently decided that hiding was not in his nature, and had come through the curtain to stand in the doorway, leaning against the frame with his arms folded, the blue shirt with its 8 buttons stretched across his chest. His wounded shoulder was hidden by the way he stood, but nothing could hide the kind of man he was. Lean, watchful, coiled the way a man gets when he has spent years in places where relaxation gets you killed. Whitfield's eyes moved over Jackson the way a stockman's eyes move over an unfamiliar animal in his paddock. Quick and thorough and missing nothing. The lean build, the calloused hands, the way he stood just slightly in front of Hannah, not blocking her but positioned, whether he knew it or not, between her and the door, between her and Whitfield. "And I see you have company," Whitfield said. His voice did not change. The smile did not waver. But something behind his eyes shifted, and Hannah felt the temperature in the room drop. "This is Mr. Foster," Hannah said, keeping her voice light. "He is passing through Taylor and needed some mending done." Shirt was torn up something terrible. Whitfield extended his hand. Jackson took it. The handshake lasted a beat too long, the way handshakes do when two men are measuring each other. "Judge Vernon Whitfield. Welcome to Taylor, Mr. Foster." "Passing through, you say?" "That is the plan," Jackson said. His voice was easy, almost lazy, the drawl of a man who had nothing to hide and all the time in the world. "Just needed a shirt and some supplies. Miss Halstead was kind enough to help." "She is kind," Whitfield agreed. "One of the most generous souls in Taylor. We are lucky to have her." The words were pleasant. The eyes were not. Whitfield's gaze lingered on the bandage visible at Jackson's collar, and Hannah saw recognition in that gaze. Not recognition of Jackson specifically, but recognition of the kind of wound that hid beneath that bandage. Whitfield knew what a bullet graze looked like. He had probably ordered enough of them. "Well," Whitfield said, putting on his hat, "I will leave you to your work, Hannah. Think about my offer. And Mr. Foster, I hope Taylor treats you well during your stay. It is a peaceful town. We like to keep it that way." He tipped his hat and walked out. Through the window, Hannah watched him cross the street toward the courthouse. He paused to speak with a man standing outside the general store, a thick-necked individual in a gray coat, who Hannah recognized as Whitfield's right hand, a man named Harlan Briggs who served as the judge's personal enforcer and problem solver. Whitfield spoke. Briggs nodded. Then Briggs turned and looked directly at Hannah's shop, and the look on his face was the look of a man being given a job he intended to do thoroughly. She also noticed, across the street and further down, another man standing in the shadow of the old mercantile building. He was not one of Whitfield's people. She had never seen him before. Tall, wearing a long coat despite the heat, with the bearing of a military man. He was watching Whitfield leave with an intensity that struck Hannah as personal. Not curiosity, purpose. Then the man stepped back into the shadow and was gone. Jackson was at her side. "That man is dangerous," he said, and he was not talking about the stranger. He was talking about Whitfield. "I know," Hannah said quietly. "I have known for 2 years." Jackson looked at her. The question in his eyes was plain. "Then why are you still here?" "Because this is my home," Hannah said, "and I do not run." That afternoon, Whitfield's housekeeper arrived at the shop with a commission. A dress for Judge Whitfield's niece, Margaret, for her birthday celebration, blue satin with white lace trim. The housekeeper laid $30 on the counter, half up front, the rest on delivery. Hannah looked at the money. $30 would cover her supply costs for 2 months. It would buy time while she figured out how to fight the seizure notice. It was also money from the man who was trying to take her shop, and possibly the man who had killed her father, and accepting it felt like swallowing something bitter and jagged. She took the money. Jackson was in the doorway when she turned around. He had seen the exchange. He looked at her and she could see him processing it, recalculating who she was and what she was capable of. Not with disappointment, with something more complicated. Understanding, maybe. recognition that survival required compromises that principles could not always afford. "You can judge me when you have had to feed a business on nothing but conscience," Hannah said. Jackson nodded slowly. "I am not judging you," he said. "I am just watching you survive, and thinking you are a lot tougher than you let on." He went out to fix the loose shingles on the roof because the water stain on the imported silk was growing. And Hannah stood alone in her shop with 30 pieces of silver in her apron, and the distinct feeling that she had just failed a test she had not known she was taking. That night, Jackson sat in the feed room behind the livery stable where Hannah had arranged for him to sleep in exchange for work. The room was small and close and smelled of hay and horse sweat and leather, and by the light of a single oil lamp he opened the ledger. He had been avoiding it. Reading it meant confronting what was in it, and after 2 days of grief and blood loss and the overwhelming reality of Hannah Halstead and her green eyes and her capable hands, he had not been ready to face more ugliness. But Eli died for this book, and Jackson owed it to Eli to know every name on every page. He scanned the columns, names, dates, quantities. Rifles mostly, some ammunition, a few entries for dynamite. The names were a mix of known outlaws and unknown middlemen, and scattered among them were names that Jackson suspected belonged to legitimate citizens of Taylor who had gotten their hands dirty for Whitfield's money. His finger stopped. The entry was near the middle of the 3rd page, written in the same cramped handwriting as the others. Halstead, 200 rifles, March 1874. Jackson read it again. Halstead, Hannah's father, Frederick Halstead. The man who had been a tailor. The man who had been Eli's friend. The man whose photograph was in the satchel. His name in a gun-running ledger, listed as a supplier of 200 rifles. The warmth that had been building in Jackson's chest, the warmth that had to do with green eyes and lavender, and the way Hannah's hands moved when she sewed, went cold. Dead cold. The kind of cold that settles in when you realize that the person you are beginning to trust might be connected to the very thing you came here to destroy. He closed the ledger. He sat in the dark for a long time, and the whiskey bottle he had been carrying since El Paso called to him from his saddlebag with a voice that was louder than conscience and softer than comfort. He drank until the coldness faded. Then he drank a little more. He did not sleep well. In his dreams, Eli's voice kept saying she will know what to do, and the words sounded less like instruction and more like warning. Jackson knew how to read people the way he knew how to read land, by what they showed and what they tried to hide. Years on the trail had taught him that a man's character revealed itself in small moments. The way he treated his horse when no one was watching, whether he shared his water in dry country, how he held his cards not just in poker but in conversation. But Hannah Halstead was a book he kept opening only to find pages missing. In the 3 days since he had arrived in Taylor, Jackson had watched her carefully. He watched the way she moved through her shop, efficient and purposeful, never wasting a step. He watched the way she spoke to customers, warm but not intimate, keeping everyone at a distance that she maintained with the precision of a woman who had mapped exactly how close she was willing to let anyone get. He watched the way she treated the old women who came to her for mending, with a patience that seemed genuine and a gentleness that contradicted the iron in her spine. And now he watched her with suspicion, and it poisoned everything. The name in the ledger. Halstead, 200 rifles. He could not shake it. Every time Hannah smiled at him, he wondered what she knew. Every time she offered him food or asked about his shoulder, he searched for deception behind the kindness. He pulled back, not obviously, not dramatically, but with the subtle withdrawal of a man who has decided not to let himself get any closer to a fire that might burn him. Hannah noticed. Of course she did. She noticed everything. She did not say anything about it. But Jackson saw the change in her face, the careful way she began keeping her own distance. And he recognized the look in her eyes because he had seen it in the eyes of stray dogs and abandoned horses. The look of a creature that expects to be left. She thinks I am leaving, he realized. The way Thomas did. The way everyone does. He should leave. He knew that. Staying in Taylor put Hannah in danger, put the whole town in danger, and every day he stayed gave Whitfield more time to figure out who he was and what he was carrying. But the ledger entry bothered him. Not just because of what it said, but because of how it felt. Something about it was wrong, not the information itself, the way it sat on the page. On the fourth morning, Jackson went looking for answers. He found Mrs. Cooper in the boarding house kitchen, elbow deep in biscuit dough, her face flushed from the heat of the stove. The old woman had taken a liking to Jackson in the way that old women take a liking to young men who eat their cooking without complaint and say please and thank you and do not put their boots on the furniture. She was also, as Jackson had quickly learned, the most reliable source of information in Taylor. Not because she was nosy, though she was, but because she was observant, and observation combined with a good memory and 40 years of living in one place made her a better historian than any book. "Mrs. Cooper," Jackson said, accepting a cup of coffee and settling into a chair at the kitchen table. "Can I ask you something about Hannah's father?" "Frederick Halstead. God rest him. What do you want to know? What kind of man was he?" Mrs. Cooper stopped kneading and looked at Jackson with an expression that was both evaluating and approving. "Good man," she said firmly. "Best tailor in 3 counties. Came out from Pennsylvania in '58 with nothing but his tools and his skill and built that shop from the ground up. Met Hannah's mother here, local girl, sweet as honey. They had Hannah, and it was a good life, simple and honest. She went back to her dough, pressing and folding with practiced hands. But then Sarah died, Hannah's mother. Fever took her when Hannah was 15. After that, it was just Frederick and Hannah, and he was never quite the same. Lost some of the light, if you know what I mean. But he kept working, kept teaching Hannah the trade. That girl can sew a straighter seam than her father could, and that is saying something. What about the last few months before he died?" Mrs. Cooper's hands slowed, her voice dropped. "He changed, got quiet, secretive. He was always a private man, but there is a difference between private and hiding something. He started meeting people at night, strangers I had never seen before, men who came and went like ghosts. And he stopped going to the saloon, which was unusual because Frederick Halstead enjoyed his evening whiskey, same as any man. And his death," Jackson said carefully. Mrs. Cooper looked at him for a long time. The kitchen was quiet except for the ticking of the clock and the distant sound of hammers from the railroad. "They said he fell off his horse," she said, "out on the East Road. Found him in the morning with his neck broke. And I am sure that is exactly what happened because Doc Rollins said so, and the sheriff at the time agreed, and nobody asked too many questions because asking questions about things that happen on roads that Judge Whitfield's men ride every day is not something sensible people in Taylor do." She leaned forward. "But I will tell you this, Mr. Foster, and I will only say it once. I never once saw Frederick Halstead fall off a horse in 30 years. That man rode like he was born in the saddle. And the horse came home without a scratch, which is a peculiar thing when you consider that a horse that throws a rider hard enough to break his neck usually does some damage to itself in the process." She straightened up and went back to her biscuits. "That is all I know," she said, "and more than I should be saying to a man I have known less than a week. But you seem like the kind of man who is looking for truth rather than trouble. And I hope for Hannah's sake that I am right about that." Jackson thanked her and went back to the livery stable, his mind working. That afternoon, something happened that changed the way Hannah looked at him, and the way he looked at himself. He was in the stable yard, mucking out stalls in exchange for room and board, when a commotion erupted in the paddock. A half-wild stallion, recently brought in from a ranch west of town, had kicked through its stall door and was loose in the yard. The animal was terrified, eyes rolling, hooves striking sparks off the hard-packed dirt, and the livery owner and his boy were pressed against the fence, afraid to get close. Jackson set down the pitchfork and walked into the yard. The stallion saw him and reared, forelegs striking the air, and for a moment it looked like the animal would come down on top of him. Jackson did not flinch. He did not shout. He stood his ground and let the horse see that he was not afraid and was not a threat. And when the animal came down, Jackson took a slow step to the side, putting himself at an angle that was not confrontational. "Easy," he said. His voice was low and steady, and as calm as a man talking to a child in the dark. "Easy now. Nobody's going to hurt you. You are just scared. I know what that feels like." The horse stamped and blew. Jackson took another slow step. His wounded shoulder screamed at him, but he kept his arms relaxed, his posture open, his movements deliberate. The horse watched him with one wild eye, muscles quivering. It took 5 minutes. 5 minutes of patience and calm and small movements, and the kind of quiet courage that does not make for exciting stories but is more real than any gunfight. When Jackson finally got the rope around the stallion's neck, the animal let out a long, shuddering breath and stood still, and Jackson stroked its neck and whispered things that only the horse could hear. Across the street, Hannah stood on the boardwalk with a package of finished shirts in her arms, watching. She had stopped mid-stride when the horse broke loose, and she had not moved since. She watched Jackson bring the animal from panic to peace, with nothing but his voice and his hands, and his willingness to be patient, and something shifted in the way she held herself. The package of shirts lowered to her side. Her lips parted slightly. She was looking at a man who did not dominate with force, but earned trust through calm. A man who understood fear and met it with steadiness instead of violence. And for the first time since Thomas Crane walked out of her life without a backward glance, Hannah felt the wall she had built around herself develop a crack. She turned and walked away before Jackson could see her face. That night, Jackson returned to the ledger. He had spent the day turning over Mrs. Cooper's words, fitting them together with what he already knew, and something had been nagging at him since the first time he read his friend's name in Frederick Halstead's false identity. Eli had lived in Taylor under a fake name. Eli had been Frederick's friend. Eli had known about the seamstress and trusted her with his dying breath. None of that made sense if Frederick was a criminal. You do not send your best friend to live in the same town as a co-conspirator under a false name. You send your best friend to live in the same town as someone you are trying to protect. By lamplight, Jackson went through the ledger entry by entry, and this time he was not looking at the names. He was looking at the handwriting. The realization came slowly, then all at once. The Halstead entry was different. Not dramatically different, not obviously different. But the ink was a slightly different shade, the letters slightly more angular, the spacing between words just a fraction tighter than the rest. It had been written by a different hand. Added later. Forged. Jackson sat back in his chair and let the implication wash over him. Frederick Halstead had never been a gun runner. He had been a messenger, helping Eli gather evidence against Whitfield. And when Whitfield found out, he did what he always did. He eliminated the threat, and then he planted Frederick's name in the ledger to frame a dead man, to ensure that even if the ledger was ever found, it would point at Halstead instead of Whitfield. The perfect crime. Kill the man, then make the corpse look guilty. Eli had known. That was why his dying words sent Jackson to the seamstress on Main Street. Not because Hannah would know what to do with the ledger. Because Hannah was the daughter of the man who had died, trying to expose the same truth that Eli had died for. She was part of the chain. She was the reason it mattered. And Jackson, for 3 days, had suspected her dead father of being a criminal, had looked at Hannah with doubt in his eyes and distance in his heart, because of a forged entry in a dead man's book. The shame hit him like a fist. He put the ledger away and sat in the dark with his head in his hands, and his guilt multiplied. Eli was dead because of him. Frederick was dead because of the same conspiracy. And Jackson had dishonored both of them by doubting an innocent man. The whiskey bottle was right there within arm's reach, where it always was. Jackson picked it up, held it, felt the familiar weight and the familiar promise of numbness that came with it. Then he set it down without drinking and stared at the wall until morning. He found Hannah on the back porch of the shop at dusk the following day. She was sitting in a wooden chair with a cup of cold tea, watching the light fade from the sky. And when Jackson sat down beside her, she did not move away. They sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that exists between two people who are still deciding whether to trust each other. Hannah measured his shoulders for a new shirt that evening. She stood close enough that he could smell the lavender she kept in her fabric drawers, and her hands were quick and sure as they moved the measuring tape across his chest, his arms, the breadth of his back. She wrote the numbers in a small notebook with neat, precise handwriting, and when she was done, she stood back and looked at him with an expression that was part professional assessment and part something else entirely. "Dark green," she said. "It will suit you." Jackson felt heat rise in his face and was grateful for the low light. "Whatever you think is best." Later, sitting together on the porch again, Hannah spoke without looking at him. "You are not telling me everything," she said. "No," Jackson admitted. "I am not." She nodded. "That is honest, at least. More honest than some." She paused. "Will you tell me when you are ready?" "Yes." "Then I will wait." It was more trust than he deserved. Jackson knew that. And he knew that when the truth came out, and it would have to come out, the distance between what Hannah was giving him and what he was hiding from her might be too far for either of them to cross. That night, after Hannah had gone to bed, she came back down to close a window she had left open and passed through the feed room where Jackson slept on the nights he stayed at the shop instead of the stable. He was not there. His cot was empty. But on the floor beside it, poorly hidden under a folded blanket, was a whiskey bottle, half empty. Hannah picked it up, looked at it, set it down. She did not say a word about it the next day or any day after, but Jackson knew she had seen it, because the silence between them changed shape. It was still comfortable, but now it carried a question that she was too patient to ask, and he was too ashamed to answer. 3 days later, at midnight, a rock came through the front window of Hannah's shop. The crash woke Jackson from a shallow sleep in the feed room. He was on his feet with his gun in his hand before the glass stopped falling, and he reached the front of the shop in time to see a shadow disappearing around the corner of the building next door. Hannah came down the stairs from her rooms above the shop, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders and a lamp in her hand. The light fell on the scattered glass and the rock lying in the middle of the floor and the scrap of paper tied to it with string. Jackson untied the paper and read it by lamplight. "Hand over the ledger or the seamstress sews her last shirt." He recognized the handwriting. He had seen it in the Dalton camp, on supply lists and orders. The Dalton gang had found Taylor. They knew where he was, and they knew about Hannah, and they were not interested in waiting. But worse than that, far worse, was the implication. The Daltons had not tracked him here. He had been too careful for that. Someone in Taylor had told them where he was. Someone who knew he was staying at Hannah's shop. Someone in town was working for the other side. Jackson looked at Hannah. Her face was pale in the lamplight, but her eyes were steady and her jaw was set. And she looked at the broken glass and the threat and the darkness outside her window with the expression of a woman who had been hit before and was still standing. "We need to talk," Jackson said. "About all of it, everything." "Not tonight," Hannah said. "Tonight we clean up the glass and we lock the doors and we wait for morning. Whatever you have to tell me, I want to hear it in the light." She was right. He knew she was right. So they cleaned up the glass together, and Jackson nailed boards over the broken window, and they sat in the dark on opposite sides of the room with the lamp between them, and the threat on the table, and the distance between truth and trust growing wider with every hour that passed. The fire started on the south edge of town at 3 in the morning. It was not an accident. The flames moved in a deliberate arc, sweeping east to west across the dry grassland that bordered Taylor's southern boundary. And the wind carried the smell of smoke into town like a warning that arrived too late to be useful. By the time the first shouts went up and the first men stumbled out of their beds, the fire had formed a crescent that wrapped around 3 sides of the south end of Taylor, leaving one side open like a chute designed to herd cattle toward a pen, or to herd people toward panic. Jackson was awake when it started. He had not slept since the rock through the window. He was sitting in the feed room with his boots on and his gun loaded, listening to the sounds of the night, when he smelled the smoke and knew immediately what it meant. He had seen this before, in New Mexico 3 years ago, when a range fire nearly killed him and Eli both. Eli's voice came back to him, clear as the day it was spoken. "Fire is just like a horse, son. Do not fight it head on. Outsmart it." He was out the door and running before the town bell started ringing. Main Street erupted into chaos. Men poured out of the saloons and boarding houses, pulling on boots, shouting at each other, running toward the glow that lit the southern sky. Women gathered children and animals and moved them north, away from the flames. Mrs. Cooper stood on the porch of her boarding house directing traffic like a general, pointing people toward the well and the water barrels and the fire buckets that hung on hooks along the boardwalk. Jackson reached the south edge of town and stopped. The fire was moving fast, driven by a south wind that was gusting hard enough to bend the flames nearly horizontal. The grass was dry. It had not rained in Taylor for 6 weeks. The conditions were perfect for exactly this kind of devastation, and whoever had set the fire knew it. He turned to the crowd of men gathering behind him. Some of them he recognized from the stable and the general store and the street. Working men, hard men, men who did not know him but who were looking at him now because he was standing at the front and seemed to know what he was doing. "We cannot fight the fire head on," Jackson said, his voice carrying over the roar and the wind. "The wind is pushing it north. If we try to put it out with buckets, we will lose. We need a fire break, a trench 6 feet wide dug across the fire's path. We cut the grass, we turn the dirt, and we take away the fuel. The fire has nothing to eat. It dies." "Who put you in charge?" one man asked. He was big and surly and smelled like whiskey. "Nobody," Jackson said. "But I have seen this before and I know what works. You can listen to me or you can stand here arguing while the fire eats your town. Your choice." There was a moment of silence, and then Sheriff Coleman, a lean man with a gray mustache and tired eyes, stepped forward. "You heard the man. Get shovels, get axes, move." They moved. For the next 2 hours, Jackson directed the fire break operation. He read the wind the way he read horses, watching for shifts, adjusting the line, moving men to where they were needed most. It was hard, brutal work, digging in the dark by firelight, the heat pressing against their faces, the smoke burning their eyes and throats. But the line held. Foot by foot, shovel by shovel, they cut a trench across the fire's path, and when the flames reached it, they guttered and hissed and found nothing to sustain them. The fire died on the south side of the trench, but it had already done its damage. 3 buildings on the south end of Main Street were gone, including the feed store next to Hannah's shop. The feed store was nothing but ash and blackened timber, still smoking in the pre-dawn light. Hannah's shop, by some miracle of wind direction, was still standing, though the south wall was scorched and the paint on the shutters had blistered. During the chaos while the men were fighting the fire, Hannah had turned her shop into a triage station. She had pulled her cutting table into the center of the room and covered it with clean sheets, and when the burned and injured started coming in, she was ready. She stitched a burn on the livery owner's forearm. She bandaged the hands of 2 men who had grabbed burning timber barehanded. She cleaned smoke out of a child's eyes with water and clean cloth. Mrs. Cooper worked beside her, handing her supplies, keeping the injured calm, and the 2 women moved through the smoke and blood and chaos with the efficiency of people who had decided that panic was not an option. It was during this time that a man slipped through the back door of the shop. Hannah did not see him. She was bent over a woman with a burn on her neck, her hands steady, her attention focused. The man was one of the Dalton gang, a wiry individual with a scar across his chin and the quick darting eyes of a rat. He moved through the back room, searching, rifling through fabric drawers and storage boxes, looking for the ledger. He did not find it. Jackson had moved the ledger 3 days ago, hidden it in a place that only he and the horse knew about. But the man was still searching when Jackson came through the front door. The fight was brief and brutal. In the cramped back room, surrounded by bolts of fabric and dress forms and boxes of buttons, the 2 men collided. The Dalton man was fast. Jackson was faster. He caught the man's wrist as a knife came down, twisted it, and drove his knee into the man's stomach. They went down together, crashing through a shelf of thread spools, and Jackson ended up on top with his forearm across the man's throat. The Dalton man wheezed and struggled and then went still. Jackson tied him with a length of cord from Hannah's supply and dragged him to the front of the shop, where Deputy Harris was standing in the doorway looking stunned. "This man broke into Miss Halstead's shop during the fire," Jackson said. "I would appreciate it if you would hold him until the sheriff can have a conversation with him." Deputy Harris took the man into custody, and Jackson stood in the ruined back room surrounded by scattered fabric and broken shelves, breathing hard, his shoulder bleeding fresh through the bandage where the stitches had torn. Hannah appeared in the doorway. She looked at the mess. She looked at Jackson. She looked at the blood on his shirt. "You tore my stitches," she said. "I am sorry about that. Sit down. I will fix them." She re-stitched his shoulder for the second time, and neither of them spoke about the man who had been searching her shop or the fire that had been set to cover the search. They did not need to. The shape of the threat was becoming clear, and words would not make it clearer. The next morning, while the town surveyed the damage, Judge Whitfield appeared on Main Street. He wore a fresh suit and a sympathetic expression, and he walked among the stunned and grieving townspeople like a minister at a funeral, offering comfort and condolences, and, to those who owned property on the south side, very generous purchase offers. "So tragic," he said to the Hendersons, who were standing in front of the blackened remains of their feed store. "But perhaps this is an opportunity to start fresh. I can offer you a very fair price for the land." The Hendersons, who had lost everything, took the offer because they had no choice. 2 other families did the same. Whitfield bought 3 properties in one morning, and by noon he owned most of the south side of Main Street outright. And his railroad expansion plan had just become significantly easier to execute. Jackson watched from across the street and said nothing. But his jaw was set, and his eyes were hard, and the fire in them had nothing to do with the one that had burned the night before. Later that day, Jackson went through the pockets of the coat the captured Dalton man had been wearing when Deputy Harris was not looking. He found a few dollars, a tobacco pouch, a folding knife, and a letter. The letter was short. It was written on paper with a printed letterhead that read, "Taylor County Courthouse, District Court." The signature at the bottom was Vernon Whitfield's. The handwriting was the same handwriting that Jackson had seen on the forged ledger entry for Halstead. The content was 4 lines. "He is at the seamstress shop on the south side of Main Street. The ledger is there. Act on the night of the fire. Make it look like the fire took the shop and everything in it." Jackson read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his pocket next to the loose button that he had been carrying without knowing exactly why. The most respected man in Taylor had ordered the fire, had ordered the destruction of Hannah's shop, had ordered, if Jackson read between the lines, the death of anyone who happened to be inside when it burned, including Hannah. He also noticed something else. The captured Dalton man, before being taken to the jail, had let something slip during the fire. When one of the townsmen asked him why the fire was set so sloppily, the man had coughed and said, "Cole did not order this. The judge did. Cole is furious. Cole Dalton, the leader of the gang, furious that Whitfield had given orders to his men without going through him. The Dalton gang was fracturing, and the fracture line ran straight through Vernon Whitfield's need for control and Cole Dalton's refusal to be anyone's puppet." Jackson filed this information away. He did not know yet how it would be useful, but he knew that a crack in the enemy's wall was worth more than 100 bullets, and he intended to find a way to make that crack wider. Hannah had always believed her father died falling from his horse. It was a simple story and a sad one, and she had carried it for 2 years like a stone in her pocket, heavy but familiar. Frederick Halstead, master tailor, good father, widower, died on the East Road outside Taylor when his horse spooked and threw him. A tragic accident, the kind of thing that happened in cattle country where the roads were rough and the horses were half wild and death came without announcement. Now Jackson was standing in front of her, the ledger open on the table, and she wished to God he was lying. He told her everything. He told her about the ledger and what it contained. names and dates and quantities, a record of gun running that stretched back 5 years and implicated the most powerful man in Taylor. He told her about Eli Morgan, who was really Eli Brennan, who had lived in Taylor under a false name because he was hiding from Whitfield in Whitfield's own town, gathering evidence one careful piece at a time. He told her about her father's role as a messenger, helping Eli, collecting information, passing it along through channels that were supposed to be safe, but were not safe enough. He told her that her father's name in the ledger was a forgery, that Whitfield had killed Frederick and then planted his name in the book to frame a dead man, that everything she had believed about her father's death was a lie designed by the man who brought her wildflowers every Sunday. And then Jackson told her the hardest thing of all. "When I first saw your father's name in that book," he said, his voice raw and stripped of everything but honesty, "I thought he was one of them. For 3 days, I believed your father was a criminal. I pulled back from you because of it. I looked at you and wondered if you knew. I was wrong. I was wrong about him, and I am ashamed of it. And you deserve to know that, too." The room was very quiet. Hannah stood behind her cutting table with her hands flat on the surface, pressing down hard enough that her knuckles went white. The ledger was open between them, its pages covered in cramped handwriting that now represented something entirely different than a stranger's secrets. It represented her father's life and death and the conspiracy that connected them. She did not cry. She did not collapse. She did not reach for Jackson or the table or anything else for support. She got angry, not at Whitfield. That anger would come later, cold and patient and useful. The anger that erupted now was hot and immediate and aimed directly at the man standing in front of her. "How long have you known?" she said. Her voice was flat and controlled and more frightening than any shout. "Hannah, how long? You have been in my home, eating food I cooked, sleeping under my roof, letting me stitch your wounds and measure your shoulders and sew your shirts. And the entire time you knew my father was murdered and you said nothing. I wanted to be sure. I wanted to protect you from it until I had the full picture. Protect me." She almost laughed. "That is what men always say. Protect. As if women are made of glass and the truth is a hammer. You were not protecting me. You were protecting yourself. Because telling me meant admitting you doubted my father, and you did not want to face that." Jackson opened his mouth and closed it. She was right. Not entirely right, but right enough that the denial died in his throat. And then Hannah said the thing that cut deepest, the thing she would regret in the quiet hours of the night, but meant completely in this moment. "You are just like Thomas," she said. "You show up. You make me believe, and everything underneath is a lie. It was not fair." Jackson was nothing like Thomas. Thomas had been driven away by Whitfield's threats, not by his own choices. Jackson had stayed. Jackson had fought a man in her shop and helped save the town from fire, and was carrying a ledger that could get him killed because a dead man had asked him to. But Hannah did not know any of that about Thomas yet. And pain does not deal in fairness. Pain deals in patterns. And the pattern Hannah recognized was this. A man she trusted had hidden the truth from her, and the last man who did that walked out of her life and never came back. "Get out," she said. "Hannah, get out of my shop." Jackson left. He went to Mrs. Cooper's boarding house and took a room and sat on the edge of the bed staring at his hands. Mrs. Cooper brought him coffee and a plate of biscuits, and sat in the chair across from him and looked at him with the expression of a woman who had seen this particular kind of male stupidity before, and was not surprised by it. "You told her the truth," Mrs. Cooper said. "It was not a question." "Yes, and you told it too late." "Yes." Mrs. Cooper shook her head. "You men are all the same. You think hiding the truth is the same as protection. It is not. It is just control with a nicer name. That girl has been controlled and managed and kept in the dark by powerful men her whole life. Her father hid his secrets to keep her safe. Thomas Crane disappeared without explanation. And now you come along and do the same thing they did, and you expect her to what? Thank you for finally deciding she was strong enough to handle it?" Jackson had no answer for that. "Give her time," Mrs. Cooper said, her voice softening. "She is angry because she cares. If she did not care, she would not bother being angry. She would just show you the door and get back to work. The fact that she is hurting means you matter to her, and that is more than most men deserve." 2 days passed. 2 days of Jackson staying away from the shop, and Hannah staying inside it, and the whole town holding its breath without knowing why. The fire damage was being cleaned up. Whitfield's men were surveying the south side of Main Street with measuring tapes and self-importance. Deputy Harris was trying to get the captured Dalton man to talk, without much success. And Hannah was alone. On the first night, she sat in her father's old chair in the room above the shop and pulled his sewing kit onto her lap. The kit was old, brought from Pennsylvania, made of worn leather with brass fittings that her father had polished every Sunday after church. She had not opened it since he died. It smelled like him. Leather and thread and the faint sweetness of the hair oil he used. She went through it methodically. Needles, thread, thimbles, chalk, measuring tape. All the tools of his trade laid out with the care of a man who respected his craft. She was looking for something, she did not know what. She only knew that the ledger had opened a door she could not close, and somewhere in her father's things, there had to be more of the story. She found it in a hidden compartment beneath the false bottom of the kit, a space just large enough for 2 folded letters pressed flat and held in place by a strip of leather. The first letter was addressed to Frederick Halstead. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the content confirmed everything Jackson had told her. It was from Eli, written under his real name, Eli Morgan, and it detailed the evidence they had gathered, the risks they were taking, and the plan to get the ledger to someone outside Taylor who could use it to bring Whitfield down. The letter ended with a line that Hannah read 3 times. "Take care of yourself, Frederick. If anything happens to me, the ledger will find its way to your daughter. She is strong enough for what comes next. I have always believed that about her." Eli had believed in her. Her father had believed in her too, in his own way, hiding his dangerous work not because he thought she was weak, but because he loved her too much to risk her being caught in the crossfire. The second letter stopped her heart. It was postmarked Kansas. The handwriting was familiar. She had seen it on grocery lists and love notes, and the inscription inside the book of poetry he gave her on her 22nd birthday. Thomas Crane. The letter had been sent to her father's shop, not to her, and it had arrived after Frederick's death. Hannah could see that it had never been opened. It had been placed in the hidden compartment by someone, maybe her father before he died, maybe Eli before he disappeared, and it had waited there in the dark for 2 years. Hannah opened it with hands that trembled for the first time since this whole ordeal began. "Dear Hannah, I am writing this to your father because I cannot send it to you directly. I have been told that if I contact you, there will be consequences for your family and mine. I need you to know that I did not leave by choice. I was told to leave Taylor and never come back and never contact you again. And the man who told me has the power to make good on every threat he made. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I did not abandon you. I was forced to go. I know that does not change the result. I know that you have been alone and hurting, and I cannot fix that from here. But I need you to know the truth, even if it comes too late. I still love you. I will probably always love you. But the man who did this to us is the same man your father was fighting, and I hope one day you will understand that I left to keep you safe even though it broke both of us to do it. Thomas." Hannah put the letter down. She sat in the dark for a very long time. Her father was murdered. Her former fiancé was driven away by the same man who killed her father. And the man she had been falling for had lied to her face for days while carrying the proof of all of it in his saddlebag. Every foundation she had built her life on was cracking, and the ground beneath her feet was not solid anymore. It was sand, and the tide was coming in. She did not sleep that night. She sat in the chair with the 2 letters in her lap and the sewing kit at her feet, and she thought about trust and truth, and the difference between them, and whether she had the strength for what came next. At midnight, she put on her shawl and walked to the boarding house. Jackson was sitting on the porch. He had not been able to sleep either. He saw her coming and stood up, and the look on his face was the look of a man who expected to be told goodbye. Hannah stopped at the bottom of the steps. Her eyes were red, but her voice was iron. "I have not forgiven you," she said, "but I believe you. And I want Whitfield to pay for what he did to my father. Tell me the plan." The night before they moved against Whitfield, Hannah sat at her workbench sewing. Not a customer order, not a repair, a shirt. Dark green cotton, the color of moss after rain, cut precisely for the breadth of Jackson Foster's shoulders. Her hands trembled, which they never did, but the needle ran straight, which it always did, because Hannah Halstead's hands might shake with fear and grief and love and everything else that was churning inside her like a river in flood, but they would never betray her craft. The craft was hers. The craft was sure. Across the room, Jackson sat in the corner, cleaning his revolver. The lamp threw their shadows long against the walls, stretching them into shapes that overlapped and separated and overlapped again as the flame flickered. Two people in the same room, sharing the same heavy air, and neither one of them spoke because there were no words sufficient for what they were feeling, and they both knew it. The plan was set. Tomorrow, Sheriff Coleman would present the ledger and Whitfield's letter at an emergency town council meeting. Hannah would testify about her father, about Eli, about the pattern of threats and acquisitions and convenient deaths that had marked Whitfield's rise to power. Mrs. Cooper would stand with them. The Hendersons, who had lost their feed store, had agreed to speak about how Whitfield had pressured them to sell. It was not a perfect plan. Whitfield had friends on the council and money in the bank and the kind of influence that turned good men into cowards. But it was the only plan they had, and sometimes the only plan is the best plan, because it is the one that gets you moving. Jackson finished with the gun and holstered it and sat back. His eyes moved to the shelf where a whiskey bottle stood, 3/4 full, catching the lamplight. He had carried it from El Paso. It had been his companion through the long nights after Eli died, his way of filling the silence, of dulling the edges of grief and guilt until they were soft enough to bear. He reached for it. Habit. Reflex. The hand moving before the mind engaged. Then he stopped. His hand hung in the air for a moment, fingers extended toward the bottle, and then he slowly, deliberately pulled it back and rested it on his knee. He did not look at Hannah. He did not make a speech about it. He just sat there with his hands empty and his eyes open and faced the silence for the first time since Eli died, without anything to muffle it. Hannah saw. She did not comment. She kept sewing. But something in the rhythm of her needle changed, became softer, and the look on her face when she glanced at him, brief and unguarded, was the look of a woman watching a man become someone new. They sat in the quiet for a long time. The lamp hissed. A coyote called somewhere outside of town. The needle moved through fabric. Then Hannah spoke. "My grandmother came from Ireland," she said. Her voice was quiet, conversational. The voice of a woman telling a story she had told herself many times but rarely spoken aloud. She came during the famine. The Great Hunger, they called it. She was 16 years old, and she crossed the ocean in the hold of a ship with 200 other people and barely enough food to keep them alive. She landed in Philadelphia with nothing but the clothes on her back and the skills her mother had taught her. Jackson listened. She married a fisherman. A good man by all accounts, strong and steady and kind. He went to sea every week, and every week she did not know if he would come back. The sea does not make promises. It takes what it wants and returns what it does not need. And every wife of every fisherman knows this in her bones. Hannah paused. The needle stopped moving. So my grandmother sewed him shirts. Every time he went to sea, he had a fresh shirt. And every shirt had 7 buttons down the front, one for each day of the week. 7 days, 7 buttons, 7 chances for the sea to bring him home or keep him. She looked up. Her green eyes were bright in the lamplight, and Jackson saw something in them that he had not seen before. Vulnerability. The kind that only comes when a person chooses to let down the last wall. But she always added an 8th button, Hannah said. one more than was needed. Her husband asked her about it once. She told him the 7 buttons were for the days, but the 8th was for hope. It was her prayer, her refusal to accept that 7 days was all there was. The 8th button was for the day after, for tomorrow, for the possibility that the world might be kinder than it usually was. The room was so still that Jackson could hear the wick of the lamp burning. One winter he did not come home, Hannah continued. The boat was lost. They never found him. My grandmother sewed shirts with 8 buttons for the rest of her life, not because she believed he would come back. She knew he would not, but because she refused to stop hoping. That was her answer to the loss. Not anger, not despair, hope. Stubborn, impossible, beautiful hope. She kept making something beautiful, because that was the only way she knew how to fight the darkness. Hannah picked up the finished shirt and held it in her lap. Dark green, soft cotton, perfect stitching. My father learned it from her. He passed it to me. Every shirt I make for someone I care about has 8 buttons, 7 for the days and 1 for hope. Jackson understood. Every shirt she had made for him. Every button she had sewn. It was not habit or superstition or a seamstress's quirk. It was a prayer. A silent, stubborn declaration that tomorrow existed, that it was worth believing in, that the person wearing the shirt was someone she hoped would still be there when the 8th day came. He stood up. Hannah stood up. The distance between them was 5 steps, maybe 6. She crossed it with the shirt in her hands and placed it across his shoulders, and the fabric settled against his skin like something that had been waiting to be there. She smoothed the collar. She adjusted the seams. And then her fingers found the buttons, and she fastened them, one by one, starting at the bottom and working her way up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Her hand paused on the 8th button. She looked up at him. Her eyes were bright and full of something that was not quite tears and not quite joy, but was both at once. And Jackson realized that he had never in his life been looked at like this, like he was something worth hoping for. "Come back," she said. Not a question, a command, the kind of command that a fisherman's wife gives to the sea, knowing the sea does not listen, but saying it anyway because the saying matters more than the hearing. "I will," Jackson said. And then they were kissing. It was not cinematic or grand. It was not the kind of kiss that belongs in a painting or a song. It was lips meeting in lamplight, the taste of salt from tears neither of them had meant to shed, the smell of new fabric and gun oil and lavender, and the clean Texas air coming through the window. It was 2 people who had been circling each other for weeks, finally closing the distance, and it was clumsy and imperfect and absolutely right. When they pulled apart, Hannah pressed her forehead against his chest and stood there breathing, listening to his heartbeat. "You need to sleep," she said. "Tomorrow is going to be a long day." "I know." She stepped back. The shirt fit him perfectly. The 8th button rested over his heart. "Good night, Jackson." "Good night, Hannah." She went upstairs. He went to the feed room. Neither of them slept. But the darkness felt different now, less empty, more like a promise. Before dawn, Jackson put on his gun belt and his hat and walked to the front door of the shop. The shirt was warm against his skin. The morning was cool and still, the sky just beginning to lighten in the east. He did not look back as he walked out the door. He could not. If he looked back, he would see her standing at the top of the stairs in her shawl with her hair down and her green eyes watching him go, and if he saw that, he would not be able to leave. In his shirt pocket pressed against his chest, he felt something small and hard that had not been there before. He reached in, and his fingers closed around a loose button, wrapped in a scrap of fabric embroidered with the letter H, the 8th button. Separate from the shirt, given to him like a talisman, like a prayer made solid, like hope you could carry in your pocket. He walked toward the courthouse with the button in his pocket and Hannah's voice in his head, and the knowledge that whatever happened today, he had something to come back to. The plan was simple. Use the ledger and Whitfield's signed letter to present the case before the town council and force an arrest. Sheriff Coleman would take Whitfield into custody. A wire would go to the State District Court in Austin requesting a formal hearing, and Taylor, Texas would wake up from the long nightmare of Vernon Whitfield's reign. Simple plans have a way of getting complicated. The trouble started before the council meeting even began. Jackson and Sheriff Coleman had gone to the telegraph office at dawn to send the wire to Austin, but the clerk, a nervous young man named Patterson, took one look at the message and went pale. "I cannot send this," Patterson said, his hands shaking. "Judge Whitfield pays my salary. He owns this office. If I send a wire accusing him of crimes, I will be out of work by noon and probably dead by sunset." Coleman tried to reason with him. Jackson tried to intimidate him. Neither approach worked. Patterson locked the office door and drew the blinds, and the wire was never sent. Without a response from Austin, without the weight of the state court behind them, the council meeting became their only option. And Whitfield knew it was coming. The Taylor Town Council met in the courthouse, a 2-story limestone building on the north end of Main Street that Whitfield himself had funded. The irony was not lost on Jackson. They were bringing the case against the man in the building he built, before a council he controlled, in a town that bore his fingerprints on every brick and beam. The room was packed. Word had spread the way word does in small towns, through whispers and glances, and the particular urgency that fills the air when something important is about to happen. Every seat was taken. People stood along the walls and spilled out through the doorway into the hall. Judge Whitfield sat at the head of the table, flanked by 4 council members, 3 of whom owed their positions to Whitfield's endorsement. He wore his white hat and his polished boots and his practiced smile, and he looked for all the world like a man with nothing to hide and nothing to fear. Jackson stood at the other end of the table. He had the ledger. He had Whitfield's letter. He had the truth. And he had the growing suspicion that the truth, in a room full of frightened people, might not be enough. Sheriff Coleman called the meeting to order and laid out the evidence. The ledger with its records of gun transactions, the letter on courthouse stationery ordering the attack on Hannah's shop, the testimony of the captured Dalton man, who had finally agreed to talk in exchange for the possibility of a reduced sentence at the county jail rather than a hanging. Whitfield listened to it all with an expression of wounded dignity. When Coleman finished, the judge shook his head slowly, the way a patient father shakes his head at a child who has told a particularly unconvincing lie. "Sheriff," he said, his voice carrying the warm authority that had won him elections and silenced opposition for 20 years. "I am disappointed. This is clearly the work of a desperate man," he gestured at Jackson, "who has brought violence and chaos to our peaceful town and is now trying to deflect blame onto the one person who has dedicated his life to Taylor's prosperity. The ledger is a forgery. The letter is a fabrication. And this stranger, who arrived in Taylor with a bullet wound and a stolen horse, is not a witness. He is a fugitive." Whitfield produced a piece of paper from his coat, a wanted poster. Jackson's face drawn in rough lines that were close enough to be convincing. The charges listed beneath it were horse theft, assault, and robbery. "This was sent to me by contacts in El Paso," Whitfield said. "Mr. Foster is a wanted man. The Dalton gang was not hunting him because of a ledger. They were hunting him because he stole from them and ran." The room murmured. Heads turned. Jackson could feel the tide shifting. Whitfield was good at this. He had spent a lifetime being good at this. "That poster is a fake," Jackson said. "Printed by the Dalton gang as insurance. There is no warrant out for me in El Paso or anywhere else." "Can you prove that?" one of the council members asked. A thin man named Perkins who could not meet Jackson's eyes. "Can Judge Whitfield prove it is real?" Jackson countered. "Send a wire to the sheriff in El Paso. Ask him." "The telegraph office is closed," Whitfield said smoothly. "An unfortunate coincidence." The room shifted again. People were afraid. You could see it in the way they held their bodies, the way they avoided Whitfield's eyes. These were not cowards. They were ordinary people who had lived under extraordinary pressure for years, and standing up to the man who controlled their livelihoods and their safety was not a simple thing. Then Hannah stood up. She was sitting in the second row, wearing a plain brown dress and no jewelry, and an expression that Jackson had come to recognize as the one she wore when she had made a decision and nothing in the world was going to unmake it. She walked to the front of the room and stood beside Jackson, and she was carrying 2 letters. "My name is Hannah Halstead," she said. Her voice shook. It did not break. "My father was Frederick Halstead. He was a tailor on Main Street for 25 years. He was also a brave man who spent the last months of his life gathering evidence against Judge Whitfield's gun-running operation." The room went silent. "My father was murdered," Hannah continued. "Not thrown from his horse. Murdered, because he got too close to the truth. The same truth that is in this ledger, the same truth that Judge Whitfield has been hiding behind his white hat and his wildflowers and his generous offers to buy our homes for 20 years. She held up the first letter. "This is a letter from Eli Morgan, also known as Eli Brennan, who lived in this town for years under a false name because he was hiding from Whitfield while gathering evidence. Eli Morgan died 2 days before Mr. Foster arrived in Taylor. He died protecting this ledger. He died because the truth was worth his life." She held up the second letter. "And this is a letter from Thomas Crane. Some of you remember Thomas. He was my fiancé. He left Taylor 3 years ago without explanation, and I spent those years believing he had abandoned me. He did not. Judge Whitfield threatened his family and forced him to leave. Because Whitfield wanted me, not as a wife, as a possession, and anyone who stood between him and what he wanted was removed." The room was so quiet that Jackson could hear the clock on the wall ticking. Mrs. Cooper stood up. "I have lived in this town for 40 years, she said, her voice carrying the weight of every one of them, "and I have watched Vernon Whitfield swallow this place piece by piece. He takes our land, he takes our businesses, he takes our silence, and we let him because we are afraid. Well, I am 62 years old, and I am too old to be afraid anymore." Hannah is telling the truth. Frederick Halstead was a good man who died for it, and it is time we stopped pretending otherwise. Silence. Then Tom Henderson stood up. Then his wife. Then Doc Rollins, who was sober for once and angry about it. One by one, people who had been quiet for years found their voices, and the dam that Whitfield had built out of fear and money and silence began to crack. And then the door opened, and a man walked in that nobody expected. He was tall, wearing a long coat with the bearing of a military man and eyes that missed nothing. Jackson had never seen him up close, but Hannah had seen him once, standing across the street from her shop, watching Whitfield leave. The man walked to the front of the room and stood between Jackson and Whitfield, and looked at both of them with the cold assessment of a commander evaluating a battlefield. "My name is Cole Dalton," he said, "and I am here to finish what Judge Whitfield started." The room erupted. Cole Dalton, the leader of the Dalton gang. The man whose name was synonymous with gun running and violence, and the lawless territories that decent people feared. Standing in the Taylor courthouse in broad daylight, unarmed, with the calm certainty of a man who has made a calculated decision and intends to see it through. Whitfield's face changed. For the first time since Jackson had met him, the practiced smile vanished. What replaced it was something raw and ugly and afraid, and Cole ignored the shouting and the chaos and spoke directly to the counsel. "I am not here to cause trouble. I am here to provide evidence. Judge Whitfield has been the Dalton gang's silent partner for 5 years. He financed our operations, took 60% of the profits, and used the money to fund his railroad and his land purchases and his political career. 6 months ago, when it became clear that investigators were getting close, Whitfield began destroying evidence and positioning the gang to take the full blame. He ordered the fire in Taylor without my knowledge or consent. He has been using my men as his personal army while planning to let us hang for his crimes." Cole produced a leather folder and laid it on the table. financial records, bank transfers, correspondence. The evidence was comprehensive and damning, and it had clearly been gathered over months by a man who knew he was being betrayed and wanted insurance. "I am not a good man," Cole said. "I have done things that will put me in prison and probably should, but I will not hang for Vernon Whitfield's greed. He made us. Then he planned to destroy us. That is not how a man conducts business, not even the kind of business we are in." The pieces clicked into place. The stranger Hannah had seen watching from across the street in Chapter 3. Cole Dalton, investigating Whitfield on his own. The sloppy fire in Chapter 5 that Cole had not ordered. The fracture in the gang that Jackson had filed away for future use. It was all connected, and it all led here, to this moment, to the most powerful man in Taylor being exposed from every direction at once. Whitfield stood up. His face was the color of old ash. He looked around the room at the faces of people he had controlled for decades, and he must have seen what Jackson saw. Not hatred. Something worse. Recognition. The look of people who had always known on some level what he was and were finally allowing themselves to admit it. "You do not understand," Whitfield said. His voice had lost its polish. It was just an old man's voice now, thin and desperate. "I saved this town. The drought of '72 nearly killed Taylor. The railroad was going to bypass us. The cattle drives were moving to other routes. This town was dying. The money I made, the money from the guns, that is what kept the railroad coming through Taylor. That is what kept the construction going. That is what kept your jobs and your businesses and your children fed." He looked at them all one by one. "I saved this town, and this town never knew the price." The room was silent. Jackson felt the weight of Whitfield's words settle over the assembly like dust after an explosion. It did not excuse him. Nothing could excuse the murders and the manipulation and the years of terror behind a mask of benevolence. But it made him human, and that was harder to deal with than a monster. The moment shattered when Whitfield moved. He drew a pistol from inside his coat. He was fast for an old man, faster than anyone expected, and before Sheriff Coleman could react, Whitfield had crossed the room and grabbed his niece Margaret from the back row. The little girl screamed. Whitfield pressed the gun to her side and backed toward the door. "Nobody move," he said. His voice was shaking now. "I am leaving. The girl comes with me until I am clear of the county. Anyone follows, she dies." He backed through the door and into the hallway, and then he was running. Jackson heard his boots on the courthouse steps, and then the sound of a horse being mounted, and then hooves on the hard-packed street heading east toward the railroad depot. Jackson did not hesitate. He ran through the crowd and out the door and across the street to where his horse was tied. The animal was saddled and ready because Jackson had learned a long time ago to always keep a horse ready, and he was mounted and riding before Whitfield reached the depot. The chase went along the railroad tracks. Whitfield had abandoned the horse at the depot and climbed onto a freight car of a train that was just beginning to move, the massive steam engine pulling its load of lumber and cattle cars eastward toward Austin. The train was slow, still building speed, and Jackson pushed his horse alongside it, the animal running flat out with its ears pinned back and its hooves throwing up clods of dirt and gravel. Jackson grabbed the rail of the freight car and hauled himself up and over the side and landed in the dark interior. Whitfield was at the far end of the car, the little girl in front of him, the gun in his hand. The car was full of lumber, stacked in heavy piles that created narrow corridors of shadow. The train rocked and swayed, and the smell of fresh-cut pine filled the space. "Let her go," Jackson said. "It is over, Whitfield. The town knows, the council knows. Cole Dalton just handed them every piece of paper with your name on it. There's no place left to run." "There's always a place to run," Whitfield said. His voice was the voice of a man who had run out of everything except stubbornness. "I have money. I have contacts. I can disappear. With a child? You are going to disappear with a 10-year-old girl and a gun and think no one will come looking?" Margaret was crying, quiet, hiccuping sobs that she was trying to suppress because she was a brave child and she did not want to make things worse. Her eyes found Jackson's, and the trust in them, the desperate hope that this stranger would fix things, nearly broke him. Jackson took a step closer. Whitfield raised the gun. Stay back. Whitfield. Vernon. Jackson used his first name deliberately. You built a church. You funded a school. You brought the railroad to a town that was dying. I believe you when you say you did it to save Taylor. I believe that part of you, maybe most of you, genuinely wanted to do good. The gun wavered. But the good you did does not erase the people you killed. Frederick Halstead. Eli Morgan. Others we probably do not even know about. You can still choose how this ends. You can let Margaret go and face the court and let the law decide. Or you can keep running and die on the road and be remembered as the man who held a gun on a child. That is the choice. That is the only choice left. The train rocked. The lumber shifted. Margaret whimpered. Whitfield looked at the gun in his hand. He looked at the child. He looked at Jackson, standing in the lamplight of the freight car with a dark green shirt and an 8th button over his heart, and the steady gaze of a man who had made his peace with whatever came next. The pistol lowered. Whitfield's arm dropped to his side. He released Margaret, and the girl ran to Jackson and buried her face in his shirt, and Jackson held her with one arm and kept his eyes on Whitfield. Sheriff Coleman climbed into the freight car 30 seconds later, breathing hard, his deputy behind him. "Vernon Whitfield," Coleman said, his voice formal and heavy with the weight of what he was doing. "You are under arrest for the murders of Frederick Halstead and Eli Morgan, for conspiracy to traffic weapons, for arson, for kidnapping, and for about a dozen other charges that the state prosecutor is going to enjoy figuring out. You will be held in the Williamson County Jail until transport can be arranged to Austin for trial at the State District Court." Whitfield did not resist. He held out his hands and let the deputy bind them, and as they led him to the door of the freight car, he paused and looked at Jackson one last time. "Tell Hannah I am sorry," he said, "for what it is worth." Jackson said nothing. "Some apologies are not yours to accept." The train was slowing for a curve. Jackson handed Margaret down to the deputy, and then jumped from the car, landing on the grassy embankment and rolling twice before coming to a stop on his back, staring up at the sky. The blue Texas sky, wide and endless and clean. His shirt was torn at the 3rd button from the fall, but the 8th button, the one over his heart, was still there, pressed against his chest, warm from his skin, holding on. Hannah was replacing the broken window of her shop when she heard boots on the boardwalk. She did not turn around. She did not need to. She had learned the sound of Jackson Foster's walk in the weeks since he had arrived in Taylor, the slight unevenness caused by the bullet graze on his shoulder that threw his gait just a fraction off center. She could pick that walk out of a crowd now, probably for the rest of her life. She kept working, fitting the new glass into the frame, pressing the putty into the grooves with a small knife, smoothing the edges. The window had been broken by a rock and a death threat 4 weeks ago, and in the chaos of everything that followed, she had not had time to fix it. Now, in the strange quiet that had settled over Taylor since Whitfield's arrest, she was putting her shop back together one piece at a time, the way she always did, the way she always would. Jackson picked up the second pane of glass that was leaning against the wall and held it while she worked. He did not ask if she needed help. He did not make conversation. He just fit himself into the rhythm of her work, handing tools, holding things steady, anticipating what she needed before she asked for it. They worked in silence for a long time. The morning sun warmed the boardwalk. Somewhere down the street, a hammer rang out as another shop repaired its fire damage. Taylor was rebuilding slowly, cautiously, the way a town does when it has been shaken to its foundations and is not yet sure the ground has stopped moving. Whitfield was gone. Escorted to Austin under armed guard 3 days after his arrest, bound for trial at the State District Court. The charges were extensive: murder, conspiracy, arson, weapons trafficking, kidnapping. The state prosecutor had arrived from Austin with a leather briefcase and a look of barely contained excitement, because cases like this made careers. The railroad expansion was suspended pending investigation, which meant Hannah's shop was safe. At least for now. At least until the next powerful man decided he needed her block for something important. But for the moment, the seizure notice was just paper, and paper could be burned. Cole Dalton and his remaining men had been taken into custody by Sheriff Coleman. Cole cooperated fully, providing testimony and documents that filled in every gap the ledger had left. Jackson had spoken to the sheriff on Cole's behalf, which surprised people and angered some. But Jackson had looked Coleman in the eye and said, "He is a criminal, and he deserves punishment. But he is also the reason we have enough evidence to put Whitfield away for good. If a guilty man helps bring down a worse one, that should count for something. The law does not have to be blind to nuance. Cole would serve his time. The county jail first, then likely Huntsville. That was justice. Imperfect and complicated, the way real justice always is." Hannah and Jackson finished the window and stood back to examine their work. The glass was clear. The putty was smooth. The shop looked, for the first time in weeks, like it was whole again. Then the morning train whistled. Hannah did not think anything of it. Trains came and went. That was what trains did. But something made her glance toward the depot. And when she did, she saw a man step off the passenger car and stand on the platform looking around with the uncertain air of someone returning to a place they are not sure they are welcome. He was average height, sandy-haired, wearing a coat that had seen better days and carrying a carpet bag. He was not remarkable in any way, except for the way Hannah's heart slammed against her ribs when she recognized him. Thomas Crane. He looked older, thinner. There were lines around his eyes that had not been there 3 years ago. He stood on the platform and scanned Main Street, and when his gaze found Hannah standing in front of her shop, he went still. Hannah felt Jackson tense beside her. She did not look at him. She was looking at Thomas, at the boy she had loved at 20, at the man who had walked out of her life and left a hole that she had spent 3 years trying to fill with work and independence and the stubborn refusal to need anyone. Thomas walked toward the shop. Each step was hesitant. And when he reached the boardwalk, he stopped a respectful distance away and removed his hat. "Hello, Hannah," he said. His voice was rougher than she remembered. "Thomas." Hannah's voice was even. "What are you doing here? I heard about Whitfield. The arrest. It was in the papers as far as Wichita. I thought maybe it was finally safe to come back and say what I should have said 3 years ago." He looked at Jackson. Jackson looked at him. Neither man spoke, but something passed between them, some male understanding that transcended words. Then Jackson did something that defined him more clearly than any gunfight or ledger or act of courage ever could. He stepped back, walked down the boardwalk, turned the corner toward the livery stable, and left, not running, not storming off, choosing, giving Hannah the space to make her own decision without his presence tilting the scale. Because Jackson had learned, through grief and shame and a long, hard education in the difference between protection and control, that love does not demand. It trusts. Hannah and Thomas sat on the porch of the shop, the same porch where she and Jackson had eaten dinner in the evenings, the same porch where she had watched the sun go down and wondered if she would ever stop feeling alone. Thomas told her everything. Whitfield's threat, the fear for his family, the desperate choice to leave, and the years of guilt that followed. He had started a tailor shop in Wichita. He was doing well, but he had never stopped thinking about her. And when he read about Whitfield's arrest, he took the first train to Taylor. "I had to see you," he said. "I had to tell you the truth in person. And I had to ask if there is any chance. If you could forgive me. If we could try again." Hannah looked at him, really looked. She saw the boy she had loved. She saw the life she had imagined. She saw comfort and familiarity, and the kind of quiet, predictable future that a part of her still craved. And she saw that it was not enough. Not anymore. Not after everything she had been through. Not after the fire and the ledger, and the night she threw Jackson out of her shop, and the night she went to him at midnight with iron in her voice and hope in her heart. She was not the girl Thomas had left behind. That girl had died somewhere in the last 3 years, and the woman who replaced her needed something different, something harder and riskier and more real. "I forgive you," Hannah said, and she meant it. "I understand what you did and why you did it. You were trying to protect your family. I do not blame you for that." Thomas's face brightened with hope. "But I am not waiting anymore, Thomas." Hannah said it gently because he did not deserve cruelty. He deserved honesty. "I am not the girl you left. I have been broken and rebuilt, and I am different now, and the life I am building is different. I hope you find someone who is still waiting. I hope you find something wonderful, but it will not be with me." Thomas looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded. He put his hat back on. He picked up his carpet bag. "He was a good man," Thomas said, and Hannah knew he was talking about Jackson. "If he hurts you, you write me. I will come back and make him wish he had not." Hannah almost smiled. "He will not hurt me." Thomas tipped his hat. "Goodbye, Hannah." "Goodbye, Thomas." He walked back to the depot. The afternoon train came. Thomas Crane boarded it and left Taylor for the second time. And this time Hannah did not watch the train pull away because she was already walking toward the livery stable. She found Jackson standing between two graves in the small cemetery on the east side of town. Her father's grave, the headstone she had paid for with 6 months of savings. And next to it, a newer grave with a simpler marker. Eli Morgan, buried in Taylor per his wishes, beside the man he had tried and failed and tried again to save. Jackson was talking to Eli. Hannah stopped at the edge of the cemetery and listened. "I did what you asked," Jackson said. His voice was quiet but clear in the still afternoon air. "I found her. I found the truth. Whitfield is going to pay for what he did. And Hannah, Eli, she is everything you said and more. I wish you were here to see it. I wish you could meet her. I think you would have liked each other. I think you would have argued about everything and respected each other enormously." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I stopped drinking, Eli. I know you never said anything about it, but I know you noticed. You always noticed." I stopped because she saw the bottle and she did not say a word, and her silence was louder than anything you ever could have said. He paused again. "I'm going to ask her to marry me. I do not know if she will say yes. I do not have a ring. I do not have much of anything except a horse and a gun and a button she put in my pocket. But I am going to ask. Because you taught me that the things worth doing are the things that scare you the most. And this scares me more than any gunfight or stampede or fire I have ever faced." Hannah stepped into the cemetery. Jackson turned. She walked to him and stood beside him between the two graves and said nothing. She did not need to. Standing there, shoulder to shoulder, looking down at the names of the men who had brought them together, was enough. Later that afternoon, in her shop, surrounded by bolts of fabric and dress forms and scattered buttons and the smell of cotton and lavender, Jackson Foster asked Hannah Halstead to marry him. He did it simply because he was a simple man, and because the grandest gestures in his experience were usually the emptiest. He did not get down on one knee. He did not have a ring. He stood in front of her cutting table and took both her hands in his and said the truest thing he knew. "I do not have much to offer. I have these hands and my word, and I have the button you put in my pocket. If you believe in hope enough to sew it into every shirt you make, then maybe you can believe in me enough to give me a lifetime." Hannah looked at his hands holding hers. She looked at his face, at the man who had stumbled into her shop, bleeding and desperate, and carrying secrets that almost destroyed them before they began. She looked at the green shirt he was wearing, the one she had made for him the night before the world changed, with its 8 buttons and its careful stitches, and all the hope she had sewn into every seam. "Yes," she said. And from behind the curtain that separated the shop from the back room, Mrs. Cooper's voice exploded. "Finally! I thought I was going to have to wait until Christmas." The old woman burst through the curtain with tears streaming down her face and a grin wide enough to light the room. She threw her arms around both of them and squeezed until Jackson could not breathe, and all three of them were laughing. and the sound filled the small shop on Main Street like something that had been missing for a very long time. 4 years later. The sound of a saw cutting through pine planks carried across the hill west of Taylor in the early morning light. Jackson Foster, 32 years old now, his dark hair showing its first threads of gray at the temples, stood on the porch of the 2-story house he had built with his own hands and ran his thumb along the railing to check for splinters. The house had taken 2 summers to build. He had done most of the work himself, with help from Sheriff Coleman on weekends and a few of the men from the livery stable when they could spare the time. It was not a fancy house. It was not the kind of house that architects would admire or newspapers would write about. But it was solid. Built from good Texas pine and limestone foundation with a wide porch that wrapped around 2 sides and windows that caught the morning light, and a kitchen big enough for Hannah to work in comfortably, and a workshop in the back where she could sew without walking to the shop in town. It was the house of a man who had spent his whole life moving and had finally found a reason to stay. Hannah came out the front door carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Jackson and stood beside him looking out at the valley below. Taylor spread out before them like a map drawn by a generous hand. Main Street was wider now. The railroad depot had been expanded, but this time by honest investment from a consortium of local families who had pooled their resources after Whitfield's assets were seized. The south side of Main Street was intact. Hannah's shop was still there, still open, now run day to day by Clara Whitmore, the young woman Hannah had taken on as an apprentice 2 years ago. Clara was talented and ambitious, and reminded Hannah of herself at that age, which meant she was going to be just fine. Jackson sipped his coffee. From inside the house came the sound of small feet on wooden floors, and then a crash followed by a silence that every parent recognizes as the silence that precedes either crying or an attempt to hide the evidence. "James?" Hannah called. "What did you break?" "Nothing, Mama." Jackson smiled. James Eli Foster was 2 years old and had his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair, and the combined stubbornness of both his parents, which made him the most willful toddler in Williamson County and possibly all of Texas. He was named for Jackson's father and for the man who had died to bring the truth to Taylor. And sometimes when Jackson looked at his son, he could see shadows of both men in the boy's face, and it made his chest tight with gratitude and grief in equal measure. The nothing turned out to be a cup which James had knocked off the kitchen table while trying to reach a biscuit. Hannah cleaned it up and Jackson held James on his hip, and the boy ate his stolen biscuit with the satisfied expression of a criminal who had gotten away with something. Sunday dinner was at the house as it had been every week since they moved in. Mrs. Cooper arrived first because Mrs. Cooper always arrived first. She was 66 now and showed no signs of slowing down. She brought a pie and a running commentary on every piece of gossip Taylor had produced since the previous Sunday, which was considerable. Sheriff Coleman came next carrying a bottle of whiskey, which he set on the table with the casual familiarity of a man who had been doing this every Sunday for 3 years. Jackson looked at the bottle, picked it up, held it to the light. The amber liquid caught the sun and glowed. Then he set it down untouched and reached for the water pitcher. It was a small moment, the kind of moment that nobody else might notice. But Hannah noticed. She always noticed. And when their eyes met across the table, the look that passed between them carried the weight of every night Jackson had reached for a bottle and put it down. Every morning he had woken up clear-headed, every small victory over the darkness that had almost consumed him. She did not say anything. She did not need to. The look was enough. Clara arrived with a cake and news that the shop had received its largest order yet, 12 shirts for a ranching family outside Georgetown. She was excited and nervous and full of questions about fabric weight and thread count. And Hannah answered them all with the patience of a woman who remembered being young and eager and terrified of getting it wrong. They ate. They talked. They laughed. James crawled under the table and stole food from anyone who was not watching, which was everyone because they were all watching him do it and pretending not to. Mrs. Cooper told a story about the time she caught the new telegraph operator trying to read her personal messages, and her righteous indignation carried them through dessert. It was a good day, an ordinary day. The kind of day that does not make for exciting stories but is the foundation upon which real lives are built. After dinner, when the guests had gone and James was asleep in his crib, Jackson sat in his rocking chair on the porch and watched the sun begin its descent toward the western hills. The sky was doing what Texas sky does in the evening, turning itself into a painting that no artist could match. Gold and orange and a deep rose pink that bled into purple at the edges. Hannah came out and sat beside him. She had her sewing basket in her lap and a small piece of fabric in her hands. Light blue cotton. A tiny shirt for James because the boy was growing faster than any child had a right to, and his clothes were always too small before they were too old. Jackson watched her work. The lamplight from inside the house fell through the window and caught her hands as they moved. The needle flashed, the thread pulled taut, and Jackson counted the way he had learned to count, silently, patiently, watching each button take its place. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Hannah's hand paused. She looked up, caught his eye, and smiled the smile that he had been falling into for 4 years now, the smile that made the whole world feel like it was exactly the size it needed to be. Then she threaded the needle through the 8th button. Jackson watched it settle into place. 8 buttons on a tiny shirt. 7 for the days. And 1 for hope. He had known the answer for years. He had known it since the night she told him about her grandmother and the fisherman and the great hunger and the refusal to stop hoping. He had known it every time he reached into his shirt pocket and felt the loose button she had given him, wrapped in its scrap of embroidered fabric, pressed against his heart through every fight and every fear and every quiet morning since. But he had never asked, not out loud, not in words, because some truths are too important to rush, and Jackson had learned the hard way that patience, real patience, was not about waiting for the right moment, but about respecting the moment when it arrived. Now, on this porch, with the stars coming out and the crickets singing and their son asleep inside, and the old horse standing in the stable with its head over the door, watching the evening the way horses do, patient and quiet and content. "Why do you always add an extra button?" Jackson asked. Hannah did not tell the story of her grandmother again. That story had been for a night of fear and courage, spoken before a battle, given like a gift in the dark. This was different. This was peace. "Because tomorrow has not come yet," she said, "and I still want it to." Jackson reached into his shirt pocket. His fingers found the button. The same button. 4 years, and it had never left him. He had carried it through the trial and the rebuilding and the wedding and the birth of his son and every sunrise and sunset in between. He held it out in his palm. "I keep your hope right here," he said. "It has never left me." Hannah put down her sewing. She placed her hand over his, closing his fingers around the button, and they sat like that for a while. 2 people on a porch they had built together, holding a small piece of hope between them. Then Hannah said something that changed everything. "Jackson." "Yeah, you know that first shirt I gave you? The blue one. The one I said a customer ordered and never came back for." Jackson remembered. He remembered the weight of the fabric on his shoulders and the way it fit him like it had been made for his body specifically. He remembered counting the buttons and finding 8 instead of 7 and opening his mouth to ask, and Hannah turning away before he could. "I remember," he said. "There was no customer." Jackson looked at her. Hannah's voice was steady, the way it always was when she was saying something that mattered too much to say casually. "I made that shirt 3 months before you ever walked into my shop. I did not know who it was for. I did not have a customer or an order or a reason. I just woke up one morning and started cutting the fabric and sewing the seams and adding the buttons. 8 of them. I could not explain it. I just knew that someone was going to need it, that someone was coming, and I wanted to be ready." Jackson looked at her for a long time. The shirt from his first day in Taylor. The shirt that fit him like a second skin. The shirt with 8 buttons that Hannah had said belonged to a customer who never came back. There had been no customer. There had only been Hannah, sitting alone in her shop 3 months before a bleeding stranger collapsed on her doorstep, sewing a shirt for a man she had not yet met, adding an 8th button for hope, trusting that the world would send her someone who needed it, the purest act of hope in the entire story, and he had been wearing it since the beginning without knowing. There were no words big enough for what he felt. So Jackson did what he had learned to do in the years since he stopped running. He held her hand tighter. He sat in the quiet. He let the moment be what it was. Inside the house, James Eli Foster slept in his crib, wearing a tiny shirt with 8 buttons, 7 for 7 days, and 1 for tomorrow. The tomorrow that his mother had sewn into fabric before she knew his father's name. The tomorrow that his father had carried in his pocket through fire and gunfights and grief and redemption. The tomorrow that both of them had earned with blood and tears and trust, and the stubborn, beautiful, unreasonable refusal to stop believing that the next day could be better than the last. Outside, the old horse stood in the stable with its head over the door, watching the stars come out. It was gray around the muzzle now. Slower. Content. It had walked into Taylor 4 years ago with blood on its saddle and a dead man's hope in its satchel, and it had found the one place in the world where it was supposed to be. No rider needed any more. It was home. The stars settled over the hill west of Taylor, and the crickets sang, and the wind moved through the grass the way it has moved through Texas grass for 1,000 years. And on the porch of the house he built, Jackson Foster held Hannah's hand and listened to the sound of the world being exactly, precisely, perfectly enough. 7 days and 1 tomorrow. That was all anyone ever needed. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.